So welcome back, everybody. And this is our fourth panel today on reparations policy and narratives, proposals for addressing colonial injustices through taxation. My name is Liz Nelson, and I work with the Tax Justice Network, coordinating our work around tax justice and human rights. We've got an exciting panel of 5 presentations. They're going to focus on, as the title says, reparation policies and ideas about how Western societies can begin to repair the damage of imperial pasts. So, as I say, we've got 5 deeply interesting papers, diverse, ranging from the nature of citizenship, who is worthy and affording citizenship through asylum to offer a means of reparation, an exploration of legal structures, notwithstanding the range of actors who do their damnedest to circumvent those. We're going to look at particular country studies to a degree. So can tax and tax paying disrupt structural injustices? There's a view from Canada and a different narrative from Zimbabwe, illustrating the tax's hindrance to development and to Black people's development. And finally, we're going to have a look at an exploration of a financial transparency transaction tax as a means of reparation. And you know, what are the political and power barriers to seeing that realized? So these are really amazing papers, and as well as I think stimulating our thinking together, I hope, and I'm sure they will, draw an emotional response, whether, you know, within our kind of privilege and whether, you know, noticeable, whether we feel discomfort around that. So let me begin by some short introductions, because the biographies of the different speakers are at the end of the program. We've got Arianne Shahvisi, who is a senior lecturer in ethics and at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. She has broad philosophical interests, including feminist philosophy, bioethics, and philosophy of science, and has published a number of books and articles. And Arianne is going to be making the case for global North citizenship as a form of reparations. And we're delighted to have with us Professor Stephen Dean, who serves as faculty director at NYU's Law graduate tax program, and is also the host of the podcast The Tax Maven. Again, I'll let you look at his biography. Professor Dean is going to be talking on redefining alternative allocation schemes to reward global South states to accumulate revenue through alternative economic activities. We then got Dr. Kyle Wilmot, who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Alberta. His research interests attends to the politics of taxation, indigenous settler relations, settler colonialism, and liberalism. And Dr. Wilmot is going to be talking about decolonising tax, how settler colonialism is enacted through taxpayer citizenship, and the construction of taxpayer interests in the Canadian context. We've got John P. Makito, who is a programs manager for the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development. And John is an economic governance expert and development practitioner of over 14 years experience, both in public finance management and public administrative programming in the NGO sector, and has special interests in anti-corruption, tax justice, natural resource governance, and sustainable public debt management. John is going to be talking about the collecting and sharing inclusive disaggregated data via tax administrations to inform race and gender responsive tax systems, the case of Zimbabwe. And finally, we've got Keval Baradia, who is an anti-imperialist political economist who focuses on developing systemic strategies to eradicate structural inequalities and injustices, including racism and poverty, through anti-capitalist and intersectional measures. Keval is also, his experiences in global trade and finance is underpinned by a 15-year career at the London Stock Exchange. Keval will be talking about recalibrating financial transaction tax narratives to provide a pathway towards reparations. So thank you for bearing with me while I did that slightly longer introduction. I'm going to, one thing just to remind everyone after the break is to put your questions and answers as we're going through in the Q&A. If you've just got comments or you want to speak to our moderators, put that in the chat, but try and put the question and answers, and the question and answer at the bottom of your screen. So let's start with Arianne, and perhaps I just hand over to you and let you start your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I've just got some slides that I hope are visible to you now.
They are, yep.
Yeah, wonderful. So thank you for having me, and thanks for putting on this, to the organisers for organising this wonderful conference. I feel a little bit out of place as a philosopher, and this is very much going to be a philosophy talk. I'll be arguing that one way in which the global north might make reparations to former colonial states is via citizenship. And this work draws on a paper of mine that was published earlier this year. And I've just put some details about that on the left-hand side of the slide. And inevitably, this is going to be a relatively shallow kind of retelling of that paper. But the central argument of that paper is that we need to be attentive to the way in which automatic citizenship for the newborns of global north states confers privileges upon those citizens, which are equivalent to a form of untaxed inheritance, of lifelong access to what are valuable resources. And what I want to argue is that all refugees, and by refugee, I'm broadly construing that, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, should also be granted automatic citizenship within global north states. And I have two arguments that I want to make to kind of motivate that contention. The first is that granting refugees citizenship can serve as a form of distributive justice and a form of reparation, which is kind of the central argument of the paper. And then the second one is that moral consistency demands that if we're granting automatic citizenship to newborns, we should also grant it to refugees. The reasoning that we use to motivate one also applies in the other case. And so the overall aim really with this paper is not so much to demonstrate the feasibility of this scheme, but more to kind of push intuitions on this and destabilize some of our assumptions around this topic. And so by refugee, I mean something quite broad here. I want to move away from the privileging of persecution as a kind of legitimate form of suffering over and above other forms of suffering. And so the definition I'm using here is anyone whose basic needs or safety are not protected in their state of origin, whether because of persecution, poverty, climate change, natural disaster, or environmental destruction. And so they seek that protection elsewhere. And also by citizenship, I mean something like inalienable or mostly inalienable access to public services and welfare, so health, education, the right to work, the right to remain in the state without fear of being returned, readmittance after leaving, and the right to vote and stand for office. So that's just by way of kind of preliminaries to set up what I'm actually talking about here. And so citizenship is kind of an interesting thing. Birthright citizenship, which is the way in which most people kind of acquire their citizenship, can be seen as a form, kind of extreme form of untaxed inherited property, which is actually quite similar to and has been compared to the entail regimes of Old English common law. So this idea of inheriting property and the benefits of that property, and that going down a line of descent without you being able to share it or confer it upon others. And so citizenship is quite similar to this. I see it as a resource because it's the gateway to other resources. And birthright citizenship tends to enclose wealth and power. So it tends to, via bordering, kind of locate wealth and power in particular places with particular people. And its distribution is, of course, morally arbitrary. Many of us get our citizenship through being born in a place or through parentage, and that is a morally arbitrary fact about us. And so it's something of a lottery. So if citizenship is a resource, then like other resources, its redistribution can contribute to addressing global inequality. And so here's the first argument then, citizenship as a form of redistribution. So you can think about this in two ways. The first way is in a geographically general sense. So it's morally apt to grant automatic citizenship to refugees coming from the global south, since global north states have designed and perpetuated global institutions which have protected their own wealth and interests and impoverished global south nations. So developing kind of institutions around trade, lending, the legitimate use of force. And so in the sense in which the global south acts as a net creditor to the global north, the global south effectively contributes to the desirability of global north citizenship, okay, which could be seen as a sort of tax contribution almost to the sorts of benefits that you get through that citizenship. So that's in a general sense. And then in a geographically specific sense, we need to look carefully at the origin states of those who apply for asylum within Europe. So places like Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Eritrea are the main kind of origin states. And then in the UK specifically, where the main origin states are Iran, Pakistan, Iraq, Bangladesh, and Sudan. And it really pays to think hard about the histories of European colonialism, imperialism, and specifically British imperialism in these regions. And so the argument that I'm making can be made more specific still. So rather than it being a kind of broad regional point, it can instead be one of kind of direct extraction. So that's the sort of broad argument for citizenship as redistribution. But I also want to make another smaller argument to kind of bolster this point. And this is about moral consistency. So just briefly to look at some numbers, about 153,000 people are granted citizenship in the UK every year. About 17,000 people are granted protection. That's about half the number of people who apply for it. And there are about 640,000 live births every year. Many of those newborns are granted automatic citizenship in the UK. And what I'm not attempting to do here is pit these groups against each other, but rather to point out that, is there really an issue of scarcity if we intend for there to be this many live births every subsequent year? And if there is an issue of scarcity, then the major challenge is from within, not from without, okay? And so I think it's right and good that we should grant automatic citizenship to newborns for several reasons. So they have urgent needs necessarily. That's part of what it means to be a newborn. Their needs can be easily met within the state that they have just entered through being born, okay? The state has the capacity to do so. And then the state that they've just entered is also a morally appropriate place for their needs to be met because they have come about through the actions of members of that state. And so I think we do need to carry on granting automatic citizenship to newborns. But I think the arguments for doing so also apply to refugees. So equivalently, they also have urgent needs, and those urgent needs are often caused precisely by the actions of global North states in the present or in the past. Their needs can easily be met by the states they have just entered because of the numbers that I just mentioned. Clearly, this kind of scarcity discourse doesn't really get off the ground. We do have space, we do have capacity. And then finally, the state they've just entered is a morally appropriate place for their needs to be met too. And that's especially if there is a historic link between the place that they're coming from and the UK or whatever their destination state is, but also in many cases because of personal ties. So quite often people choose to claim asylum or to seek asylum in a place where they may have some familiarity with the language and the culture, generally because of those colonial ties. But I think there's another point to be made here as well, which is that from a moral perspective, it does not seem right to hold resources in reserve for future newborns who are not yet existent and deny those resources to existing refugees who need them in this moment. So just to quickly counter a few counter arguments that might be raised, objections that might be raised to the arguments that I've just made. So the obvious one, overpopulation and resource scarcity if we admit greater numbers of refugees. And just to respond to this, there's what's a demographic crisis within the global north in terms of reduction in the number of working age people. This can be addressed by greater numbers of migrants. Migrants are net contributors, and that's what all the numbers show us. And migration accordingly then strengthens the welfare budget for everybody. And then finally, even if that was not the case, because I'm very suspicious of these sorts of arguments in any case, refugees' needs outweigh the costs, outweigh the kind of burdens that they may place upon the states they attempt to enter. And then a second counter argument, maybe inheritance is defensible here. So maybe we can argue that the newborns of UK citizens deserve to have automatic citizenship because of their ancestors' contributions. Well, that argument doesn't really get off the ground because the descendants of colonial and neo-colonial subjects must also accordingly inherit. And because that claim has not yet been made or met, perhaps their kind of claim upon us is actually greater. But also considering things like colonial era tax payments, the benefits of which were not fully seen, and also modern healthcare brain drain. So brain drain in the current moment, the extent to which the NHS, for example, relies upon the work of migrants and also does not repay the contributions of taxpayers in the countries that they come from towards their training. And then finally, this idea of dishonesty and abuse, that such a system could be abused. I mean, it's a common argument that's been made. Just to quickly rebut that, I think it's clear that disrupting one's life in the way that a person who is migrating chooses to do is not a normal human choice. But also this dishonesty discourse is very much a part of the current regime, where one has to conform to a very narrow range of legitimate forms of suffering. And so just to conclude then, while automatic citizenship for newborns is morally justifiable, it's not justifiable to deny citizenship to existing asylum seekers while holding those citizenship resources in reserve, knowing they'll be going to these future newborns, so to future people rather than existing people. We should grant asylum and or citizenship to all those who desire it because it's a form of redistribution or reparation. And also, as I've said, because the same reasoning that motivates automatic citizenship for newborns compels the automatic citizenship of refugees. And I think it's one of the simplest and most morally fitting ways of making amends for the wrongs of colonialism and addressing the ongoing inequalities of neo-colonialism, and has the benefit of being almost instantaneous. It doesn't require the time that it takes to build up kind of institutions elsewhere that can provide for people. And I think even if the scheme that I've just presented seems infeasible in some way, and I think we should always be suspicious of kind of claims of infeasibility. These considerations ought to, at the very least, visibilize and destabilize many of the assumptions we make around this issue. But also, I think the value of citizenship and attempts to maybe calculate that could form the basis for formulating reparations in other ways. Thank you.
Arianne, thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting. And I was so interested when I read about, you know, this idea, which seems quite bizarre, of and worth destabilizing, that you hold on to resources for unborn people when they're actually people with you who have been impoverished by colonial extraction, basically. And yeah, a fascinating paper. Thank you so much. I'm going to move us straight on to Stephen Dean. Stephen, please take the floor, so to speak, and switch on your camera.
All right.
Hi.
Everybody. Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you so much to Alex and the other organizers, Professor Bambra, Professor McClure. And I also want to thank Professor Bambra for her Anish Kapoor poster. A nice reminder of the before times. There was a beautiful sculpture he did in one of our nearby parks in Brooklyn. So I've been having happy thoughts about that this morning. All right, so I'm going to be talking about redefining alternative allocation schemes to reward global South states to accumulate revenue through alternative economic activities. And another way of putting that rather long title is why not a digital services tax? We're trying to understand why states are not able to engage different sources of revenue in the current regime. It's helpful to understand the ideas and the structures that are perpetuating the current system. All right, so I am going to move forward. All right, so this is the predominant narrative about international taxation, and I think it is certainly valid. There's a lot of truth here. You have sort of the state of nature above, and then civilization below. But I think it's a little more complicated than that might suggest, and I hope I'll persuade you of that over the next few minutes. So imagine you wanted to send a letter from Philadelphia to Harlem, and this was a long time ago, and you would have had a pretty hard time doing this at the time. How would you do it? You would first pay to have the letter go from Philadelphia to New York. Then it would go from Philadelphia to Le Havre, and then overland to Harlem. And this obviously is a system that was somewhat cumbersome, not very easy to operate. And it really does, to me, it evokes something much more contemporary, and I think you'll see that when I switch to the next slide. So this is the breakdown of that system, which now starts to look a little bit more like tax to folks, I think. And this was how it broke down, right? So you paid the 5-cent fee to get it to New York, then 85 cents for the rest of the way, and 50 cents went to the French, and 35 to the Netherlands. Of course, all paid on receipt by the recipient, which is its own sort of problem. And when I look at these numbers, what I'm reminded of is the latest sort of alternative revenue scheme that is sort of up for debate in the global space. That is the rise of digital services taxes and the contestation of those taxes by the global north, especially the OECD and the United States. And it's important to understand the nature of the objections that are being raised by those states. And I think that to understand, situate the structures that make it difficult for states to even think about imposing these kinds of taxes. Of course, many of the folks that are participating here are historians. When I talk about this to lawyers, this is a little more confusing. But of course, we know that the systems that are in place today were not inevitable. They were structures created in order to impose order on a complicated world in which it was shrinking and growing all at the same time. And the system of taxation that does not allow space for digital services taxes or other alternative revenue schemes was part of that. You know, the postage stamp that replaced that beautiful but cumbersome system of mail that we saw earlier on, and all the rest, time zones and all those other artifacts of modern life. And I'm going to explain a little bit, just briefly, how that tax system works and why it is incompatible with these alternative schemes and how it could be made compatible. All right. So the framework that applies generally to international taxation has been, when the League of Nations described it 100 years ago, what they referred to was classification and assignment. And this is still the basic structure of international taxation today. You have rigid categories of income, say distinguish between business income and royalties. Then you assign those cross-border business income to one jurisdiction, and the cross-border royalty income is assigned to a different jurisdiction. And if you are clever, or your lawyers are clever, you're able to, in some cases, reclassify your, say, your business income. For example, say your Apple, you're able to change the category of that business income so that it becomes reclassified as royalty income, and then you can shift it to a different jurisdiction. That is classification assignment. That is both the good and the bad of it. It is good because it prevents excessive taxation. Only one jurisdiction has claim to any given income item because it is classified and then assigned only to one state. The bad is that it allows taxpayers great freedom to reclassify and therefore reassign their income. So the way to think about classification assignment and the challenges it poses for alternative revenue schemes, such as digital services taxes and others that we'll hear about today, is a question of whether there are too many categories or too few. And I say the answer is really both. So the question of too many categories is one that Katerina Pastor has raised. She describes it as coding, and we've heard that in this conference as well. This is a process that allows private actors to create preferential treatment, especially for capital. Pastor's book is The Code of Capital, and classification assignment is the way that private actors are able to recode and gain advantages for their capital in the tax space. But there's also a different problem, that there are too few categories. And this is the notion of numerous clauses that the United States especially has raised in recent years, arguing that the number is closed. There is no space for new categories, new classifications, so that we cannot make way for new revenue schemes, new revenue sources like digital services taxes, or perhaps the financial transaction taxes that will be discussed soon. And it's important, I think, we all understand the power of ideas and what the classification assignment system has done to inhibit the growth of new and alternative revenue sources. And in the project that this is part of, a long, complicated project that I won't go into in too much detail here, but it's questioning certainly this numerous clauses argument that has been raised to challenge new funding schemes, new revenue sources. I don't think that numerous clauses is really, I think it's a novel argument that the United States has made challenging digital services taxes. We will see whether it prevails. I do think that it is very likely to not succeed. I do think that we're seeing that now in the international tax space. The inability of the OECD to impose this new notion of its pillars is, as Alex has suggested, a good sign. And perhaps if we had a shift of power to the United Nations or another more broadly situated regime, we might be able to see a little bit less of both coding and numerous clauses going forward. I look forward to your questions and hope I'll leave you. I just love that envelope. So I'll leave you with a moment of the envelope. Thank you so much, everybody, for giving me an opportunity to share this. And I look forward to speaking with you more. All right.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was excellent, really interesting. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions about that, and interesting to maybe see what you think more about the movement towards the UN. So, thank you so much. So we're going to move straight on, I think, to Kyle Wilmot, who's Kyle, if you're there, you put your video on.
Let's just share my screen here.
Great. Okay.
We can see this?
Yep, we can. Brilliant.
So just thanks to everyone for the organizers for putting this conference together. Before I start with the actual research, I just wanted to quickly situate my own research a little bit. Some of the things that I've written about. My own research has mostly been concerned with the construction of the taxpayer from the vantage point of governmentality studies, genealogy, and sort of some indigenous studies. And it's primarily looked at the taxpayer as a political actor that attempts to arrest state action, but at other times seeks to sort of enhance the ability of quote unquote taxpayers to exercise power over others. And in the instance that I'll talk about today, thinking about how it is that the state might use those ideas of taxpayers in order to enact certain kinds of governance. So in the talk, I want to offer a couple of thoughts about decolonization and tax in the context of Canada, which is a settler state. And the goal is to think through what it might mean to say decolonization, empire, and taxation in a settler state that actively uses tax to question and quash indigenous sovereignty. So obviously for indigenous peoples, indigenous nations in what is now Canada, tax as a political legal concept has much different connotations than for others. And I've seen how this relationship plays out radically in radically different ways. Obviously, as my research is sort of concerned with the social life of tax and how taxpayer politics are practiced. And specifically how it is that they contribute to inequality and ongoing colonial rule. And the other thing that I do want to, of course, emphasize is that I am, again, speaking about ongoing colonial rule in Canada. The Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson has written about really interesting tensions between Canada and members of the Mohawk Nation, my own nation, in relation to tobacco smuggling, cross-border tobacco smuggling. And she points out that the conflict is less about tobacco and more about the enforcement of cross-border taxation and the Canadian state's vision of its own territorial sovereignty. And the Canadian state's attempt to legally enforce cross-border excise taxes on cigarettes, especially for the Mohawk Nation, whose reserves in our traditional territory spans the Canadian and US border, what is now that border. Tax, and if this conference has helped us see anything, is not simple in any way. And it's not simply about how we've decided to live morally in a democratic state. I don't think it no longer simply accords with the notion of justice and potentiality of sharing solved burdens. But obviously, if we think about tax from a decolonial lens in a settler state specifically, we can boldly sort of underline tax as an assertion of sovereignty, as also a revancist legal method, or as a method of economic and cultural assimilation. And the Canadian bureaucracy that's responsible for administering First Nations people in Canada, what I would colloquially call Indian affairs, has long really been enamored by the idea of tax as a currency of civilization. And so examining how we can think about tax outside of the sort of realm of an affirmative liberal state building project must be a part of how it is that we decolonize how we think about tax and decolonizing the actual practices of taxation. And part of that sort of decolonizing concept, I think really it's important to both take Indigenous perspectives seriously on tax, but not only on tax, but concepts that flow from tax or flow into tax, like something like property, right? And so obviously my position here is not to chide other scholars, but to build a methodology, I think, for complicating how we view tax in a settler state. And the contributions that I've seen in the conference are very exciting to see the work done toward this. And just a further assertion that this is not necessarily a call for sort of inclusion in terms of both scholarship or in terms of the actual practice of taxation in Canada. Obviously, inclusion is not the point of decolonization, especially in a settler state. But by looking at tax through a decolonial lens in the realm of a settler state, I simply mean that we need to rethink the political ownership of taxation and to unsettle its legitimacy and the analysis of it. So in my research on the First Nations Financial Transparency Act, I show how Indian affairs bureaucrats look to wield the notion of taxpayer as an inclusionist weapon against Indigenous nations, attempting to make the idea of tax paying into and operating through citizenship spaces as a taxpayer would help Indian affairs in their sort of long-standing goal of assimilating Indigenous nations that Canada is built on into Canada. And Audra Simpson, to turn back to her, points out to be taxed is to be a citizen in many cases, right? And for those who belong to Indigenous nations, tax authorized by and for Canada, right, is to pay for one's own colonization. And for those who remain strongly committed to the idea of Indigenous nationhood, whether that's a Mohawk nationhood or whatever other nation you might be thinking of specifically, tax is often one of those methods that the Canadian state might use in order to make new Canadians. And it's also done significant work in playing a double role of maintaining moral boundaries between imagined taxpayers and similarly imagined non-taxpayers. So I want to view the tax, skip that slide, forgot that one. I want to think about, raise some suspicions, let's say, and approach the taxpayer subject less as a benevolent or affirmative positive identity or identification. That's one. And second, think about the fact that the taxpayer subject is not actually exceptionally concerned with tax as an actual material or economic exchange, but as a sort of moral symbol of political sovereignty, right? So I want to contest the sort of neutrality of the taxpayer, both as a political and legal actor, and show how that taxpayer comes to figure themselves as a figure of both political, apolitical objectivity and as an efficient of legal sovereignty, as we see in Canada in many cases. And so the suspicions that I do have about the taxpayer as a positive element of governance are elided by the settler colonial assumptions that are built into the modern civilizing intellectual project of taxation in settler colonial states. I wanted to suggest, of course, that to be seen through taxation, to be seen through taxpayers as a form of subjecthood, right, is often in the case of Indigenous folks, right, is a form of misrecognition. And in many cases, an attack on sovereignty, and it's to be rendered as a dependent, as an appendage, and as a population, really, to be managed and surveilled. And so the longstanding anxiety with the sort of fiscal nature of citizenship in a settler state like Canada looms very large in the history of Indigenous settler relations and continues in the present as Canada's still a colonial state. The apparent non-taxpayers has a very large role, right, in that Canadian fiscal imaginary. And the settler imperative is one in which taxpayers act as investigators and deputies almost of the federal government, actively questioning the tax status of those with what we would call Indian status, right? And navigating the social space of indigeneity with zeal and ignorance. And the people that raise this kind of tax talk, you know, as a taxpayer, I say this, as a taxpayer, I say that, right? Really fundamentally, I think have thought about these complex issues. Why is it that Indigenous people in many cases were exempted from certain taxes, but pay others, which is the absolute case? Or why it is that Indigenous people might disdain tax, right, to fund a state that exists on its territory, or in subsidizing a state that has plundered previously collectively held resources and turning them into property. So this is the main thing that I'm thinking with recently, and thinking about how it is that settlers and that idea of tax paying and taxpayers is not only used as a method of inclusion or assimilation, but also simultaneously a form of boundary work around how it is that people are imagined to act as officiants of legal sovereignty, right? But also to undermine Indigenous sovereignty and the nationhood of Indigenous nations within the space that Canada occupies. That's all I'll say today, so thanks.
Thank you, Kyle. That was great. Another, again, really interesting paper, and it makes me think of, I actually also think of the human rights work and you know, there's too little attention paid to impact and assessment of impact of what certain taxes do, and describing it not being just a blunt instrument, but a much more malevolent force than that. So it was brilliant, thank you. So let's move on to John Makito. John, if you're there, and I think, are we there?
Yes, thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to also thank the organizers of this conference, which is going on and quite insightful, and all the previous presenters. And I would like to proceed with the presentation by way of, my presentation is trying to connect the historical overview of Zimbabwe's taxation system and the current tax injustices that we are experiencing in Zimbabwe as a classical former colonial state. I do argue in my paper that the current tax injustices that are experienced by the citizens of Zimbabwe, they were inherited from empire, and they are structurally linked to the systems that were inserted and set up by the colonial powers then. And I also go on to argue that the tax system was deliberately designed to perpetuate gender inequalities, to perpetuate racial inequalities that existed between Black majority and white minority then. And so this is the general outlook of my presentation. And yeah, to start with, I think maybe just a brief historical overview of the tax system. And the tax system currently enforced in Zimbabwe under the authority of the Income Tax Act is strongly linked to the tax regimes that were there in the colonial era. And taxation in our context is not a new concept, as tax systems evolved from traditional ideologies perpetuated from pre-colonial era up to current days. The incidence of tax from a traditional perspective occurred from as far as the old states and empires that existed before the colonial era, such as the Rhodes state, and these were, of course, in the form of tributes, both monetary and non-monetary tributes to chieftaincies, sometimes in the form of labor and so forth. But coming to the colonial era, the purpose of tax was quite different, because whereas during the pre-colonial era, taxes and tributes were paid as a form of loyalty and also for redistributive purposes, to ensure that there is equitable distribution between the rich and the poor, and that the vulnerable are actually catered for. And also to support society and vulnerable members of society in emergencies, in times of disasters and so forth. But during the colonial era, tax was then used as an instrument of oppression, as an instrument to whip the Black majority into line, and such that they surrendered their labor to the white minority, simply because there was this resistance by the Black people to work for the white employers. So one of the early forms of taxes that came in to enforce such an agenda is the 1894 hut tax, which was introduced and set at 10 shillings per hut, and this tax was imposed on each adult male. And again, to note it was gender specific. Taxes were gender specific. And then the hut tax was paid in the form of money, labor, sometimes grain, sometimes livestock. And it was also used to destock, during the colonial era, early days of the colonial era of colonization. The Black people owned more cattle than the white settlers. And in order to stock cattle from the Black majority, cattle were forcibly taken from the Blacks as a way of tax. And also there was tax that was imposed upon each head of cattle. So this forced the Black people to surrender their cattle, because they could not keep up with the required taxes. And so we see that tax benefited the white minority as they raised money, enhanced their economies, liquidity, and facilitating the further development of the white minority. The whole purpose of tax system to benefit the people at large through services provided by the government was rather defeated, as the greater proportion of tax was paid by the Black majority for the benefit of the white minority. You had other forms of tax like poor tax, and you find out that there was also tax imposed upon each excess wife. So as a way also maybe to discourage polygamy and so forth, there was tax imposed on each excess wife, according to the definition then. then so the administration of tax policies was mainly to compel, like I highlighted earlier on, the African to surrender their labor power to the settler economy so as to depend on them for the money with which they could meet their tax obligation. And other forms of taxes, like I highlighted, poor tax, progressive taxation of polygamous wives, and marriage fees, among other forms of tax that were also discussed. I noted from yesterday's discussion that we had similar experiences even with Kenya. But just to highlight as well that 40 years after independence in Zimbabwe, we continue to see a perpetuation of the indiscriminate forms of taxes that are still being employed. In other words, state capitalism has not changed its form during the days of colonial administration and even now. And yes, we have achieved political independence, but I do submit that there's still a lot of economic emancipation that is required for the majority of the population in Zimbabwe. Tax administration currently in place still perpetuates racial inequalities, racial discrimination, and class discrimination and inequalities, because the taxes are not race sensitive, not gender sensitive, whereas you find that, for example, women, the constitute majority of informal sector employees, because we have got more than 5% of the Zimbabwean population employed in the informal sector. And the forms of taxes that we do have, they do not take cognizance of that. And in the end, you find that as the government tries to tax as much as possible from the informal sector, using taxes such as presumptive tax and so forth, they are also increasing the tax burden on women specifically, who constitute the majority of the informal sector. And the colonial tax regime was such, was that bad to the extent that even the local people, gave it a local, term, chibaro, which is literally translated to rape. It was that forced, it was that, intimidatory and abusive to the extent that people likened it to forced sex, forced, marriages and so forth. And it flourished the construction of the idea and reality that tax is an instrument that distributes wealth from the poor to the wealthy or to the richer part of the population. We continue to see exclusion being perpetuated in current tax administration systems, and the submission being made is that the tax system in Zimbabwe has not helped to bridge the inequality gap. It has not in any way improved the material conditions of the majority poor in Zimbabwe, who most of them are actually women, because women in Zimbabwe, they constitute more than 52% of the population. So this is what we've continued to witness, and it is something that is of concern. And the paper actually then proposes that by using gender disaggregated data to inform tax strategies, taxes will begin to work for women, lessening the brand of unpaid care work, as the delivery of gender responsive public services will be promoted. This is the submission that we make, that there is need to collect gender aggregated data to inform tax policies. Otherwise, gender blind tax policies continue to perpetuate the inequalities that exist, the discrimination that exists, and so forth. And women who operate in the informal sector are more adversely affected by taxes because they earn a lot less. And I'm saying that the government seems not to be cognizant of this fact, which is established And types of taxes paid by women in the informal sector include custom duties, because we do have a lot of cross-border economic activities as people cross the borders to South Africa, Mozambique, Botswana, to earn a livelihood. They are faced with a lot of taxation, heavy taxation, which reduces their disposable incomes. Presumptive tax, but it's imposed, it's uniform on all forms of informal sector businesses, and it affects women mostly. And then market fees, worker license, associated fees. And I'm sorry for this example, but you said that public fees imposed on public toilets affect women the most, because you can have men can afford to use the bush, can use other means, but women really need the use of public toilets. And when there are high fees, it discourages them and it taxes them the most. And this is the extent to which taxes in Zimbabwe are gender blind. Then, storage fees, and then intermediate money transfer tax, because women are faced with a lot of care burden and care for the family. So in every day transaction that is done, there's a 2% tax that is deducted flat on any form of transaction, regardless of the type of goods and so forth. So this is the extent of the gender blindness of the taxes that we have. And so so this is an ordinary women vendor on the streets, but she has to face up with heavy taxes that are imposed by the government. And in my conclusion, I do submit that there is need to enforce gender-responsive, gender-sensitive tax reforms in order to break away from the colonial past, in order to ensure that we bridge the gap between race, between class, and so forth, and also in order to empower the marginalized and vulnerable sections of the population. I'll stop here. I look forward to interact with you more, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to ask, and maybe I will share my paper as well. Thank you very much, Liz.
John, that was super. Thanks so much. It's so really important to have those, that kind of nuanced, illustrative kind of picture of how taxes, impact on, race, gender, class, and what the legacy has been from a kind of colonial system. So thank you for that. We're going to move straight on to our final speaker, Keval Baradia. Keval, if you're there, I don't know if you have slides or not. Oh yes. So over to you, Keval.
Great. I think, am I sharing my?
Yes, you're sharing your screen. Yeah. We can't see you, but we see your screen.
I'm going to close this, I think. And are you seeing the presentation?
Yes, seeing, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm using two screens for the first time.
All right.
Zoom
okay.
Call.
Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try and be as quick as possible. And thanks, Liz, and my fellow panelists as well, for those great talks. And generally the 2 days, the organizers, TJN, and our professors, thank you very, very much. I'm going to be briefly talking about my paper called Recalibrating Financial Transaction Tax Policy Narratives to Provide a Pathway Towards Reparations. I think it will be available on the TJN website on Monday to download. I'll first explain what are financial transaction taxes, or FTTs, as they are commonly known, why they came into being, and how liberal economists, civil society organizations, and politicians have tried to use them to curtail the ills of capitalism. After I've laid out some of the background of the FTT, I'll focus on why this tax should be recalibrated into a more profound space, that can mobilize people into fighting for reparations and revolutionary change that must accompany it in order to combat the root causes of climate change and inequalities. So first things first, what are financial transactions taxes? They are tiny tax on financial markets trading. Financial markets encompass trades and bets on shares or bonds, currencies, gold and silver, and other metals, wheat, sugar, oil and gas, carbon credits, and almost every other conceivable financial and commodity asset on paper or mined. Trades take place between the world's biggest organizations and the world's richest people. These bets can be done on organized exchanges or off exchange in the over-the-counter market bilaterally between investment banks. Financial markets enable trillions of pounds of capital to flow between countries and companies for investment returns. These include companies who supply weapons of mass destruction, fossil fuel companies, mining companies using private militias, companies paying poverty wages, companies whose value chains require human trafficking and modern slavery to survive. And the financial markets are a £28 trillion a day global casino, legitimized by a legal system built on colonial ideologies. The financial markets are opaque with little public oversight or accountability. They cannot even be regulated by their governments as intended, and are instead offered bailouts despite manipulating markets, interest rates, and crashing economies. What should be made clear is that the sum of trading in financial markets is an indicator of the spoils of enslavement. It can be considered its present day value. It is believed that around a third of all trading happens right through London, a result of Britain's dominance in colonial exploitation and now international finance. There are about 20 very minor FTTs operating around the world, taxing a tiny proportion of financial markets. The oldest FTT is in the UK and has been in operation since 1694. It was introduced as a means for the Crown to efficiently raise revenue for its imperial expansion, including its war with France. The UK tax has not materially changed over the centuries, let alone kept up with the explosion of derivatives trading that occurred from the 1970s following economic liberalization. Governments never raised or revamped the tax following the 2008 financial crash as a means to make the financial lobby pay for the destitution it caused. The public paid for it through austerity, which in the UK at least contributed to over 130,000 deaths. The global financial lobby are responsible for more than 50% of the UK Conservative Party's budget. 18 million came to the Conservative Party from just 5 hedge fund backers during the last election. That is actually quite a small amount of money for top finance sector workers. Salaries of prolific London-based hedge fund managers are now over £1 billion a year. That's £4 million a day. The inevitable path capitalism takes is to become unregulatable and predominantly concerned with unproductive hyper-financialization of society that's already been talked about today. And we have to accept that under capitalism, there is hardly any demarcation of where the financial lobby ends and the state begins. I mean, a tax on financial market gambling is not a new or entirely revolutionary thing. Back in 1939, the English economist John Maynard Keynes advocated for a tax unsuccessfully on financial market trades because he felt speculators would come to dominate the markets. In 1972, US Nobel Prize winning Keynesian economist James Tobin famously and unsuccessfully called for an FTT on foreign currency trading to, and I quote, throw some sand in the unproductive wheels of international money markets. Tobin is widely cited as by economic justice campaigners as the leading intellect behind FTTs. Tobin did not see the historicity of all contradictions of capitalism. As a Eurocentric and neoclassical economic ideology, Keynesian economics is fixated with capital markets reaching national equilibrium and maximizing utility and economic growth, it does not analyze power or imperialism, let alone the need to abolish capital. Liberals and Keynesians, in their efforts to try and remedy capital, rather than dismantle it, dismiss its systemic failings, fail to recognize structural inequalities that premeditate it, and in doing so, contribute to maintaining imperial relations and the current world order. Pro-capitalist liberal policymakers and civil society organizations that are ideologically driven to work at market-led approaches and trickle-down visions of growth to solve poverty legitimize imperialism through the charitable industrial complex. Liberal FTT campaigning grounded by Keynesian economics is incompatible with reparations and revolutionary change that's required. The most recent attempt in the UK was championed by the 2019 UK Labour Party. Labour's proposals drew on two papers published in 2017 and 2019 by the UK non-profit Stamp Out Poverty, who campaigns for the FTT under the name of a Robin Hood tax. The narrative of the proposals were pro-capital in ideology. The papers argued that a new FTT would contribute to less volatile short-term trading, as well as go on to raise nearly £9 billion by 2024. The papers argued the FTT would make the UK, and I quote, a citadel of long-term finance, end quote, romanticizing empire perhaps. The narrative was as close as possible to the imaginary of capitalism and an already apathetic financial and political sector. CSOs that wish to have the debate on the terms of the financial sector and within the confines of parliamentary politics have already lost, because reparations and system change are never going to be negotiations with those who have military might to protect capital. They're going to be concrete and radical demands made by the immovable force of an international movement of movements in all corners against those who own and control the world's capital and governments. A reparations and systems change approach is not bound by the ideological limitations of pro-capital liberalism. That presents a problem for CSOs. Decolonization done like this presents an epistemological problem for ideologically liberal and Eurocentric CSOs wishing to be involved in reparations and revolutionary change movements. CSOs are not funded, created, organized, and placed to dismantle imperialism. Their mandate is to try and reform existing systems of production to make them less severe on individuals. Solutions are based on ensuring equal access to the Eurocentric notion of rights, so long as they provide equal opportunity to participate in capitalism without stopping to ask who ultimately benefits by the creation of yet more waged and neoliberal consumers and who does not. Through international development, remedies for capital are applied locally because they are tangible and statistically relevant to donors. But whilst material conditions may have improved as intended, capitalist exploitation has not been eradicated. It has simply moved elsewhere. Allyship between CSOs and decolonization and reparations movements are, however, necessary to build broad grassroots movements for change across people in the global north and south subjugated by capitalism. Some CSOs have opened important spaces for respecting and listening to authentic decolonized knowledge on long-standing struggles, resisting the most violent of atrocities. Other CSOs and the corporate sector have paid lip service to Black demands, or some have appropriated Black movements. In these latter approaches, not only are structural inequalities unaddressed, but liberal actions blunt, obfuscate, and apoliticize capitalist exploitation and its origins, and ultimately do more harm than remaining silent. Allyship involves co-learning and amplification of heterodox and decolonized knowledge that locates itself outside the comfort zone of acceptable liberal debate. I'm going to end on this last slide here, which is what does allyship look like? For reparationists, Pan-Africans, Black revolutionaries, structural decolonial movements, and others working on systems change view capitalist exploitation and plunder as inherent in the design and rules of international politics, trade, and finance that were laid down during colonialism. For these groups, exerting energies towards liberal reform of a system steeped in blood is not only anti-structural and not systemic, they're dishonorable to centuries of struggle. As Kwame Nkrumah analyzed, quote, capitalism is but the gentleman's method of slavery, end quote, and must be dismantled to meet the 5 accepted principles of reparations. The enslaved racialized chattel were the capital that made capitalism. Authentic strategic activism is the fight to dismantle it as it underlies today's structural inequalities, imperial plunder and exploitation of people and lands. It's about redistributing and democratizing resources. Where CSOs are willing to recognize the systemic causes of inequalities, including racism, they can help shift the debate. They must first accept that the debate until now has been on liberal terms within the bounds of colonial Eurocentric economic hegemony. This needs to be replaced by a counter-hegemonic, anti-imperialist narrative that centers truth-telling of enslavement and colonialism and the historical and present-day crimes of imperialism and capitalism. In Britain, that means accepting its army and navy, monarchy, judiciary, parliament, trades and guilds, imports and exports, gold reserves, banking, investment and insurance companies, and its oil and gas and coal mining industries, its hegemonic arts, education and culture, and many others are imperialist endeavors. Western governments have for centuries enacted regime change to protect capital from socialist resistance, from resistance against racialization, enslavement, and theft of lands and resources. Capitalism relies on an industrial military complex to protect capital in order to assert its influence on uneven trade, sovereign debt bondage, and extractivism today. If CSOs claim to work on systems change, a new economy, Plan B, etc., the starting point must be recognition that imperialist ideologies maintain capitalism. CSOs must be unafraid to engage with heterodox economic thinkers who provide this account and a structural pathway to reparations and systems change. CSOs must prevent the work of grassroots individuals and organizations from being appropriated, whitewashed, and greenwashed through liberal discourse and practice. CSOs must be anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist in all spaces. I'll end my presentation here, but I'll speak in the next panel about how the tax could operate and the preliminary estimates of how much tax could be raised per day to go towards reparations and systems change. Thanks very much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that. That was great, and a lot for us to reflect on, and how we, particularly in civil society, frame our work and our thinking. We've got about a quarter of an hour, and we've got a lot of questions. So I'm going to go ahead straight away into the questions. 2 questions actually immediately for Arianne. One is, Arianne, would your thesis apply to refugees between global South states such as from Bangladesh to India or from Ethiopia to Sudan? And the other question from Layla was, really appreciating your presentation, the citizenship as distribution link. Can it also explain the flow of remittances back for development at individual community level?
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. In terms, so that first one about refugees from a global South state to another global South state, which is obviously really important because that's where most refugees end up, in fact, settling or staying for some period of time. And I lived in Lebanon for a while, and obviously Lebanon is currently a temporary home, at least, to lots and lots of Syrian refugees, and that's a massive burden on Lebanon at a time at which it can't really support that burden. So it's a very important question. I think, yes, my argument would apply to the extent to which the conditions I've described do hold. So those being that there is this kind of relationship between the two states, with one having been in some way, even if indirectly, responsible for the situation the other state has found itself in, the situation those people have found themselves in. So that's the kind of responsibility criterion. And then the other one is this idea of actually having the capacity of actually being able to help in some way. And I think that, you know, those two may not apply in some of those scenarios, in which case the arguments I've made today would not apply, which isn't to say that there might not be other arguments for that. I mean, there's obviously just a straightforward argument from the urgency of somebody's needs, that they should be, you know, temporarily resettled somewhere where their needs can be more readily met. But that would be a different sort of argument. So I think the arguments I've made today are quite specifically oriented around that, those particular conditions. So that this is like a almost restricted open borders position, rather than me just kind of advocating an open borders position more generally. So that's kind of an answer to the first question. And then the second one was about remittances, and I'll just answer that quickly. Yeah, I think remittances are interesting because at the moment they're almost like a really informal version of what I'm saying, sort of, that kind of depends on the whims of the individual, right? So you've got people who have found themselves in states where they've migrated to states where they can earn a lot more than the state that they came from, and then they're sending money back, right? Which tends to happen on a very informal basis, but definitely reflects the difference in value of citizenship or settled status between those two states, that they can send such substantial sums of money back, is definitely indicative of the fact that citizenship has a value, and that's what creates that kind of dipole there almost. So yeah, I think it's another really good point.
Great, thanks, Arianne. Another question here, which I think I might start off by asking to Kyle. Definition of settler state. When, if ever, does a state stop being one? And is this related to the question of native species in ecology? What do we choose as our starting point? So again, maybe Arianne, you might have some thoughts, but Kyle, if you have some.
So just, the quickest sort of definition one could give for a settler state was a sort of colonial state or a colonial project that looks to replace the existing population, right? So in terms of Canada or the United States or Australia or something like this, the states were founded on that idea of replacing the population, getting rid of the indigenous nations that existed there, and creating Canada or the United States or something like this. The second half of the question about, sorry, what was else? Let me just scroll back to see if I can find it. Yeah, sorry, I've forgotten the second part.
Yeah, so the second part is, so when, if ever, does a state stop being one? Is this related to the question of native species? In ecology, and what's where do we choose the starting point?
Right, well, I won't address the second half of that second part, but the first part is in relation to when does something, stop being a settler state. I think a lot of people, especially when you talk about Canada, I don't know about in Europe, but Canada always has this sort of warm, fuzzy kind of reputation, harmless, polite, et cetera, et cetera. And it's sort of, people don't really think about Canada as a colonial state. In fact, our last Tory prime minister said that we had no history of colonialism, things like this. And so people ultimately just sort of forget that Canada literally is built on a variety of indigenous nations that have existed for a very, 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 very long time previous to Canada. And that Canada's ultimate sort of political goals around those indigenous nations, right, whether it be a Mohawk nation or Cree nation or whatever nation we're talking about, is to eliminate them. That's the simple sort of answer I can give.
Sure. And maybe, Kyle, while we've got you on camera, there's another question I think directed at you. Is there a way of getting the European population of Canada to accept reparations to First Nation peoples, payments and tax-free allowances? and I've heard resentment expressed by otherwise progressive people, and just your sort of reflections on that.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's a tough one, of course, as well, because you know, there are already limited circumstances in which people that have what we would call Indian status do not have to pay income tax. And if you live on the reserve and you accumulate income on the reserve, then you would not have to pay tax on it. But if you work off of reserve and live on the reserve, you have to pay tax. And there's it's a very complex system. So there's very limited things like that. But the absolute vast majority of Native people in Canada do pay tax, and all kinds of tax, of course. But the question, yeah, the question of sort of reparations, there's sort of very long-standing sort of movements, right, and sort of land back, literally giving land back, territory, expanding reserves, ensuring that Indigenous nations are not being trampled on by the Canadian state through self-determination. And yes, the European population of Canada is, for the most part, extremely resentful of these kinds of things, and it's not something that's. I mean, one can simply say it's not going to be popular for any political party to come and say, you know, we're turning your property, right, over to the territory, over to the nation who actually owns that property. It's not going to be a popular thing ever, really. It's always going to be that sort of quite a struggle. So yeah.
Thanks, Kyle. Okay, I'm going to try and get 2 or 3 more questions in. One that's got a few votes. I'm not sure whether, John, you'd like to first have a go at this, but others please do as well. So what really is the main reason for continuous underdevelopment / poverty right across the continent of Africa and areas where British colonization was imposed and existed? And adding to that, is there any connection between Victorian England, Dickensian period, yeah, caused mainly by the effects of the Land Enclosure Act and feudal land tenure system? And while you're just having a think about that, I'll just add in another question, which again has got a couple of votes, again for Arianne from Gominda. I've just lost that. Oh, here it is. So Gominda says, I find your argument really interesting, and it links nicely to Tendendai Akiumi's article, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, on migration as decolonization. My concern, however, with both pieces would be how this helps address the situation of those who are left behind in the places where refugees have come from. So I'll leave that with you, Arianne, and John, if you have some reflections on that first question.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Maybe on the first question, maybe I'll take the first part. The reason behind the continued underdevelopment of the African continent. I think we have to look at that question from, I would say, 2 perspectives. Number one, neocolonialism. I think we continue to have a strong stranglehold on African continents, and then also, I mean, neocolonialism has come in different forms and various instruments being used to exploit, you know, the African continent. And then I think the second part being the extractive nature of institutions in the African continent itself. I allude that to, you know, poor governance within the African continent, the appetite to extract, to loot, corrupt greediness within individuals and institutions governing the African continent themselves. So those are two submissions. The first one really to say that there has been continued reliance on the African continent for the supply of raw materials, for the supply of valuable minerals. We have, world reports that billions of dollars are lost from the African continent due to illicit financial flows on a yearly basis, and we still have transnational companies, conglomerates, which represent empire in its broadest form. We have the colonial powers deconstructed, but we still have the agents of colonial powers in existence in Africa. We still have our Anglo-Americans operating everywhere. We still have these other companies, multinational corporations that are repatriating profit on an annual basis to home countries, and this is, it has really underlined the underdevelopment of the African continent. Practices such as underpricing, overpricing, over invoicing of goods as a means to repatriate profit and capital to home countries. These are practices that are very rampant, and like I said, that we've got political state capture that we've witnessed in the African continent, where the leadership within the African continent saw the opportunity to lead countries as an opportunity to amass wealth for themselves and their cronies and those within them themselves. We've seen how military regimes, have amassed the wealth and banked these monies and financial assets in tax havens in developed part of the world, in Europe and other countries. So this is some of the key drivers of underdevelopment of the African continent, in my own view. Poor economic governance, continued stranglehold of the continent through neocolonialism. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. And Arianne, if I don't know if you need me to repeat the question, but if you could keep that brief, because I see there's a question there for Stephen Dean. If possible, we'll try and get that in before 15:15.
Yeah, I'll just respond really quickly. Thanks, Gaminda, for your question. I finished the paper, the actual published paper, with the thought that I don't think the kind of regime I've described is the ultimate solution. I think the ultimate solution is that people have a home within the country in which they are born, right? And that migration shouldn't be necessary in order for somebody to have their needs met. I'm under no illusions that the kind of regime I've described, I know that's not going to come into practice, and I know that it would be kind of violently resisted by global North nations. And so really my aim in the paper is to really push us on the contradictions which underwrite the current reality, not necessarily with the hope that what I've described will come true, but with the hope that we will rethink the global inequality that underwrites these migration trends. So I think that's really the shortest answer that I can give to that question. But I've kind of fleshed out that concern within the paper.
That's super great. Thanks, Arianne. So Stephen, if the question to you, and I'm afraid it's it'll need to be quite a brief answer, or else Naomi, our next moderator, might not forgive me. But what do you think about the role of international organizations such as the OECD in international taxation rules standard making for the purpose of intra-nation tax distribution justice?
That's a great question, and I'll answer briefly. I don't want to get you in trouble. I think it's really a question of agenda setting, right? So this is pretty obvious over the last decade or so. The enforcement of personal income taxes have been prioritized through CRS and other measures, whereas corporate income tax collection has been de-emphasized, and that has implications. So when you control the agenda, it's not even just the nature of the solutions you structure, it's what you choose to prioritize and deprioritize that can have huge implications along those lines. So great question.
Thank you, Stephen. So, and very very prompt and short. Thank you for that. Brilliant. Okay, so that really just leaves me to say thank you to all our panelists. I really enjoyed preparing for this session, and very different perspectives. And as I think Keval said, he will be in the next panel as well. So there were some questions for you, Keval. So hopefully you can engage with them through the next panelist.